You're listening to the Riff Chord podcast.
I love that intro. That beautiful voice you hear is British pop singer Sazzy. She has a new album coming out April 1st and a new single called Hot Stuff. I can't wait to hear it. Go to www.sazzyxo.com. You're going to love it. So this is the second half of my discussion with music writer David McPherson. In this part, we talk about the game of working as a professional writer, finding your voice, finding gigs, and getting that book published. David starts out the discussion by saying he wasn't scared away. In truth, we just took a 5-minute break, stepped out in the hallway, had a glass of water, and then came back in at that great Hefner studio at the Kitchener Public Library, where they do have a cafe in the lobby too. We could have sat and had a coffee if time allowed for it. But this is a good one. All writers pay attention, and we're going to have more of these in the future. Please drop Sazzy a line and let her know that she should come on the podcast too. She's so busy making her album. I haven't been able to snag her yet, but she's going to be a good one too. All the best. Here we go. This is part 2 of our discussion with writer Dave McPherson, the author of The Legendary Horseshoe Tavern, A Complete History. Now we're turning the discussion to... Oh, and thank you for coming back, David.
No problem. You didn't scare me away.
Oh, good. Exactly. Now we turn the discussion to life in the writing world. And, when I read your book, David, it occurs to me that I'm a writer, too. You and I have a bit different styles. You're more of a true storyteller. It actually, reading your book and seeing how you work made me reflect on my own style. I'm a little bit more... take the hard technical stuff and explain it in clear language. Whereas you're a little bit more of the journalistic style and truly taking, someone's story and finding unique and interesting ways to tell it. So how did you get your start in this business?
Well, that kind of, it makes sense because, I always consider myself a storyteller.
Sure.
I am a writer, author, but, what I do is tell people stories. And that does go back to my journalistic training, I think, as you alluded to. And it really started, my love of writing, I guess, first and foremost. As a kid, I always enjoyed the creativity involved. English was my favorite subject in school and the one I probably excelled at the most. I loved to read. And that all kind of culminated in, my last year in high school when I took the writer's craft creative writing course. And that was the first time I really was challenged and to write in a lot of different styles. And, my confidence really grew. I had a fantastic teacher who, just to go back to part 1 of our conversation, and she still lives in town, ends up, she's a good friend of my mom's and family. And,
great.
She came to, the book launch that I had here actually at the Kitchener Public Library in December of 2017. So that was kind of neat. But basically, I won a contest for all of Waterloo County for a piece of prose I wrote.
Oh, beautiful.
The end of high school.
Yeah.
And that kind of gave me a bit of that confidence. So, maybe this is something I could do or could pursue.
Absolutely.
And so heading to university, I decided to major in English. And to get back to the journalistic style, that's when I decided in my first year to volunteer for the student newspaper at University of Western Ontario, the Gazette. And, that would be my advice to any other aspiring writers out there. Getting experience is like any job or any skill. The more you do it, it's practice, better you get at it, and better to get that practical experience. And, whether it's college, university, or just even though the newspaper business in a lot of ways is dying these days, and, papers are struggling. There's a lot more opportunities, I think, out there online through blogs or other sites. But to go back to my own experience, volunteering for the student newspaper, I was thrown right into it. I had never, written, an article, never really had a story published, and they basically, the sports editor, that's who I went to initially, said, all right, go over to Huron Flats and, cover the varsity soccer game and, do a couple interviews and come back and write the story.
Yeah.
So, I think that was a little nerve-wracking to think but hey, I did it.
Yeah.
And, looking back on it, I think, it was not the greatest story, but what they talk about the expression of baptism by fire, or whatever it is, just being thrown into it. And, that initial feeling of, seeing what I had visualized, what I reported on, wrote it down on the paper, and then picking up that paper the next day and seeing my byline. I mean, that is an incredible feeling that I don't think has ever gone away. I still really enjoy that. And that's part of the, what I love as a writer is when you see your name in print, you think, hey, I did that, right? Even when, your confidence sometimes becomes a little shattered, and you a bit of that self-doubt creeps in, but then you think, hey, I did this, and it's a good feeling. So that's really how it started. And then throughout university, it progressed where into my final year, I became the entertainment editor. And that's, going back to the music, it was, that was something, I always loved sports and music, but the music side is where I was drawn to. And, that was the best training I could have had to, become a professional writer, combined with my education. But, in that newsroom, I mean, you're surrounded by so many other people who shared similar interests and passions. And it's pretty neat that student newspaper, I can look today and a lot of my network in the field and people I've met and, people that are still out there working as journalists.
Yeah.
A lot of them, got their start at the same student newspaper.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, I've never worked as a journalist. As someone who's worked in corporate communications for 20 years, I have worked with a lot of ex-journalists, and they all talk about a couple things that you mentioned. One is the deadline-driven nature of that industry really creates a discipline, and it really hones your craft in not only writing fast, but thinking through quickly what would be the angle and how you could approach that. And a lot of cases it's baptism by fire at the beginning, but you develop a rhythm from which you can work from and think quickly. And quite often they talk about, the editor will say, because they're filling in spots in the paper, can you write 50 words on this, right? Go now. And, and after a while you get in the rhythm of just doing that and being able to produce good content. The other thing that they always talk about, everyone talks about their first byline.
Yeah.
And even I noticed, did you watch HBO The Wire?
No, I haven't seen it.
One of the seasons kind
of
follows a newspaper in Baltimore. But the young lady, for her first byline, wakes up in the middle of the night, gets dressed, goes down to the printing press. She can't even wait for it to hit the newsstands, right? She wants to get it hot off the presses, right?
Yeah.
And so that was really neat that you mentioned looking at your first byline. A lot of journalists end up in corporate communications, and that's. Did you have a similar path?
Yeah, I guess I did. I mean, my first job out of journalism school, to just backtrack quickly, after I got my undergraduate degree, I ended up going back to Western and doing a master's in journalism. And then my first job in Toronto was as the managing editor of the Toronto Raptors game day program.
Oh, cool.
For a small sports marketing company called the St. Clair Group. And that was fantastic. It was right, as not long after the Raptors had come to Toronto and become a team. It was right when the Air Canada Centre was being built. So that was pretty neat to see the new building come together. And but that job was only lasted for about a year or so, and I was ready for a change. And that's when I decided. Rather than kind of looking at the journalism side of things, a few people had told me, well, you should look into getting a corporate gig. And I found something at a government agency. And, from that point on, what happened is for many years, it was a nice balance. I had the stability, and there was a fair bit of variety within the corporate environment.
Yeah.
And like I've told people, a lot of it was you're really like a corporate journalist in a way. I was going back to that idea of a storyteller. I was just telling stories within the corporation and telling both the stories of the employees and telling stories to external stakeholders, customers, whoever it might be, in different ways, using different vehicles, always knowing the different audiences. But at the same time, to get that more journalism fix, if you will, I was doing freelance writing on the side, mainly in sports. I covered the Toronto Raptors for a little bit for the National Post, doing some game day beat reporting. And then I started to write about golf for some magazines, and I continued the music writing. So it allowed me to get some of that creativity and some of those areas where I had passion outside of the day job, while still writing. And that was kind of the main skill that I tapped into within the corporate world.
Oh, fascinating. And those are all areas that you are personally interested in, the golf, music, sports. So you're really, finding a good outlet here for your skills and your personal side as well. Yeah,
for sure. And that's the other advice I've always, given to any writers. I mean, it really is, the best thing is to write about what you know and follow those passions even within your writing. It makes it, that much more enjoyable. You tend to bring that passion out in your writing, so your writing tends to come alive a lot more. But at the same time, knowing that you to survive as a writer, you've got to take all sorts of gigs and write about all different subject matters. And in a way, too, that's what I love about being a writer, that by writing about, whatever it is, whether it's, what are the best frozen pizzas, for a restaurant industry magazine, or, writing for, a home builder magazine on, what are the latest trends in, building environmentally friendly homes, or, whatever it is, you get to expand your own knowledge and learn a lot about a lot of different topics, sometimes maybe that you might have not explored or gotten into on your own.
No, exactly. And that's one thing I love about being a writer, and one thing I always encourage people to do is really see these as opportunities to dive into different topics and learn about them. And even though they may seem boring at the beginning or not what you wanted, you'd really be surprised at how much it can be. Each industry or each project has its own interesting story.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's your job, is to tell it. You just reminded me when you said that you worked for the provincial government. I did too. I was there from 2002 until 2008, and as a writer in communications. The first assignment I got the low person on the totem pole assignment, which was called the Minister's House Book. And the reason nobody wanted it is because you had to come to work very early in the morning. You started around 7, so you leave home at 6:30 or whatever.
Yeah.
And that job is to go through what was in the news and what was in the legislature to identify things that the minister may have to speak about in the House or in the press that day, and then write the speaking notes for that day. So when everyone comes to work, you say, okay, here's what was in the paper last night. Here's what we're going to say.
Right.
And that was very much like although I didn't have a newsroom experience, that was my equivalent to that, right? Where I had to think on my feet and think, okay, everyone's going to be at work in 20 minutes. Right? What are we going to say? And I, as much as I didn't like getting the low person on the totem pole gig, I'm grateful that I had that experience. It made me fast. It got me in the habit of thinking about what the messaging is, thinking about quickly how it's going to play out. And, I really regard that now as one of my positive experiences as a writer.
Yeah, well, when I worked at the LCBO, I mean, as a team, as our communications team, we did a similar exercise. That was first thing in the morning. We all, were divvied up whatever papers we had to review, or a few online, whether it was, wine journals or whatever, and find out anything that made reference to the LCBO, made reference to wine, beer, or whatever it might be, so that by the time, the rest of the leadership team came in, and the president and whatnot, we had a package put together.
Oh, wow.
Of what's in the news, what should you be aware of?
Right.
So we had done that work for them in a way.
Yeah.
And it is a great exercise to for you to stay on top of your industry.
Yeah.
And also make those news judgments of what is really important and what is maybe something nice to know, but really it doesn't need to be included in the package today, right?
No, exactly. So in 2007, I went to a writers' festival, the Wolf Island Crime Writers Festival. And at that time, and like a lot of people in there are trying their hand at crime writing. But the guest speaker was a guy called Giles Blunt. And I now notice that there's a Canadian detective show called Cardinal. And if you look at the bottom of the opening, it says based on the novels by Giles Blunt. So at that time, Giles actually had his stories published as novels. And so everyone at the conference wanted to find out, how did you do that?
Yeah.
So let's pose that question to you, David. So everyone has an idea for a book that they want to get published, but you actually successfully had yours done. Can you share with us, how did you make that vision turn into a reality?
Yeah, and like I tell people, there was a little bit of luck involved. Like I come to believe in life, there a little bit of right place, right time, but also you've got to be in that place, and you've got to seize these opportunities. And my experience was probably a little different than many others, and that's what you find. There's no simple way, whether it's a fiction book, nonfiction like mine, of how you get published. I think these days it's a lot easier with the ability to self-publish and print on demand. And, if you want to write a book, I mean, you can easily do it. I mean, a lot of people, you've heard these stories, they start with, like yourself, a podcast or a blog or something, and then, that ends up turning into a book. But for me, it was one where that was one of my kind of dreams, and that I'd one day have a published book. And I think the music side of things has always been one of my biggest passions, and I read a lot of books about music or the music industry, biographies by musicians, that kind of thing. So I was at one of my other favorite bars beside the Horseshoe Tavern when I lived in Toronto, called the Dakota Tavern.
Okay.
And
where's that, David?
It was at Ossington.
Okay, yeah.
And Dundas.
Okay, yeah.
And just listen. The band escapes me. It doesn't matter who I was listening to, but I met another writer there, journalist, and I just, in our casual conversation, in between bands, I mentioned how I've always wanted to write a book on music. And he mentioned, I know this publisher, Dundurn, that they're looking to do more music titles. I can pass on, the editor's name there.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So for me, it was I wouldn't say it's as simple as that, but then I thought, okay, there's got to be a sign. I wrote to that editor, pretty much the next day.
Yeah, of course.
Sent off a few ideas. And in a way, there was a little serendipity. I think that one of the ideas was about a book on the Horseshoe Tavern, because I knew that, it was coming up on its 70th anniversary. So I thought this would be a great peg. Yeah. And right away, he came back, said, the sales team were actually, throwing about that same idea, or happened to, think that would be great. Can you give me some more details, or write like an actual proposal? So that's what I did. And next thing you know, I was, had signed, a publishing deal with Dundurn Press in Toronto,
Amazing.
And so it was pretty amazing. But, you hear about a lot of other stories where, people send queries to, and get rejections and that. And, while I faced, lots of rejections over the years, just pitching ideas to magazines and editors and that kind of thing, when it came to, pitching the book, in this case, I was, a little lucky.
Fantastic. And the amount of work that goes into a project like this, how would you rate it against writing a long article, or writing a newspaper article?
Well, I think the biggest thing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I think the one key difference is the amount of research involved.
Right.
So for me, that's what made this a a lot more work than, like you said, just doing a long 2,000 word feature where maybe you interview 2, 3, 4 people. You do a bit of pre-work, researching about the people you're interviewing or the subject matter. Yeah. But here, when it's a much broader topic, you're going to extend it to a book length. I almost felt the research phase is what really is the most time consuming. I spent a lot of time at the Toronto Archives, and then I wanted to do as many first person interviews as I could to get those perspectives.
Of course.
And so that was the time to set up all those interviews, transcribe all those interviews, and before I even got to the writing phase.
Yeah. And one thing I like that you do in the book is you allow the people to really tell their story. You've got a couple first-person interview quotes that go on for a couple pages. And
that was something I guess I made a conscious decision. Sometimes I think it's better to just let the person tell the story in their own words rather than you trying to rewrite it or tell it yourself. I mean, it's almost like what we're doing now. It's as if it was a radio interview, and you're just letting them share that. And it really depended on the story and who the person was and how they told it, where I thought, rather than me paraphrasing it, I think it will be much more powerful, and it will add to that conversational style that would make the story come off the page that much better.
Yeah, good choice. I'm not sure a lot of writers would have made that choice. Well done. That's David McPherson, a Canadian writer and journalist. Look for the book on Amazon or Indigo. The Legendary Horseshoe Tavern, A Complete History by David McPherson. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Paul. It's been a real pleasure chatting today.
Okay, all the best.
The Riff Chord Podcast.